Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming. Africa is growing again. That's the good news, but the question is, how do we ensure that it lasts? The next graph here shows the history, basically the trend of per capita GDP growth in Africa starting from the 1960s. And you can tell that if you compare the mid-60s to the early 70s, the type of growth rates that we're getting, about 3% per capita, was pretty much what we are getting now, that everybody's basically celebrating. So we're saying that, but then look at what happened in the middle, end 70s to about the beginning of the 90s. We had a growth collapse. Can you hear me in the back? That lasted for almost about 2 decades. Some call it the lost decade. It's a period of structural adjustment and all that stuff to try to respond to that. So the question is, how do we ensure, this time the growth built on stronger foundations so that we don't repeat this, and in fact this leads to sustained growth that provides job opportunities and leads to shared prosperity. How do we ensure that? Our response to that is that we need to put this growth on a firmer foundation, and to do that, there are different ways of, and our answer is that we need to pursue economic transformation, not just growth. Now, different economics is not an exact science, so I'm sure there may be other good definitions for economic transformation, but after looking at all the evidence and the analysis, we boiled it down to 5 elements, the acronyms. So basically say we need to grow through depth, not shallow growth. And the depth, the D, basically means that we need to expand the type of the goods and services that we produce and are able to export. We need to, in today's global economy, we need to be competitive in our export markets, and we need to create productivity all across all sectors, from the smallholder farmers to industry and the office workers in the cities. We need to technologically upgrade how we produce things. At the end of the day, what really separates developed from developing countries, not so much per capita income, so it's the technological capability with which they're able to do things in the economies. So that's important. And we're also saying that we don't do all these things just for their own sake. We do it with the expectation that somehow it will impact on human lives. And then one can, this is a very big, broad topic. One can choose all kinds of indicators. But since we wanted to stay very close to the structural economic analysis that we were doing, we just picked 2 things: per capita income and expanding productive job opportunities. That to signify, we are very much aware that there's a lot more that goes into human work, but at least we're saying that people have good jobs that's paying them well. To a large extent, they can take care of some of these, like healthcare and other things themselves. So there may still be other things that are important. It's not, but at least we think that's a start. So we say growth with depth. I lost mine. And what we set out to do in the report is basically to provide, our ultimate aim, as KY says, is to try to shift the focus of policy debate in Africa from just poverty reduction or just growth to this fundamental structural change that leads to growth that provides employment and is sustainable. And we wanted to provide analysis that will inform this debate, and we also wanted to provide a precise tool that allows us to measure progress in this direction. That's why we came out with the Africa Transformation Index. And this report, what we've done is that we provide a clear definition based on the DEATH acronym of economic transformation. We've used it to evaluate the performance of sub-Saharan African countries as a group compared to 8 comparator countries, 6 from East Asia and 2 from Latin America, Chile and Brazil, and then we have Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and maybe I've missed
Singapore.
Singapore. And so when we compare these countries over a 40-year period, from about 1970 to about 2012, and then we use the African Transformation Index to also compare African countries among themselves, again, using the same metrics based on the DEATH framework. And then this allows us basically to conclude that over the 40-year period, African countries, the economies in Africa haven't really transformed the way that we measure transformation, and that there's a need to up our game in this direction. And then the rest of the report is split into two parts. One discusses a number of themes that we think are important for transformation, and I'll take you through very quickly. And then there's a set of chapters that discuss, okay, now where are the prospects? Where are the low-hanging fruits? If you really want to pursue transformation, where do you start? And so we provide some pointers. I want to say we don't provide a blueprint. What we provide is ways of thinking about these things and information for policymakers to begin their search. We don't provide, we are not, but it's not necessarily, we are not saying every African country should go do exactly what the things that we describe here. So I'll take you through a series of slides that basically tries to make the point that African countries have not transformed. And so we look at GDP per capita growth, but we know that story. On the right is diversity in production, where we use the share of manufacturing in GDP. And you see that over the 40-year period, it's practically stagnant, whereas in, say, the comparator countries, they've been going up. Then there's also diversity in exports that shows that, I mean, this, if you take the 5 top exports in each country, and you find that generally they tend to be about 60–70% in African countries, whereas in the comparator countries they're about under 50%, and they haven't really changed that much over the period. And the last thing, we just basically saying how in today's globalized world you have to be competitive, and so we do a measure that just take your share of exports in world export market, but knowing that small countries are likely, because they're small, they are likely to have a small share. We try to correct by that by their share in GDP. And we also do another correction. We're saying that if you are country X and foreigners come in and basically dig oil from your offshore and export for you, and therefore you have a large export share of export in your GDP, doesn't really say that you're competitive. So we take out extractives from these export figures. And that's the figure on the left there. And again, you see that, in fact, I mean, again, in all these figures, the blue line is sub-Saharan Africa, and the light green is the comparators. And you see that in terms of export competitiveness, the blue line, the African countries are going slightly down, which indicates that all this big, even that with the big growth and export of, a lot of it has been based on extractives. Once you take the extractives out, we are not doing so hard. Okay, these are still some more. The last one shows just if you look at 1970 in terms of where we were in per capita income versus where we were around 2002. In the comparator countries, they've increased by about over 5 times. In Africa, we haven't been able to even double. So this is the agenda, basically making the case that, look, we have work ahead of us, and we need to really up our game in terms of the transformation direction. We use these indicators to build the African transformation index. There's a lot more that goes into that index than this, but these are just highlights in the report. And by the way, the report can be downloaded from africantransformation.org. So, I mean, I don't think we have enough copies here. So those of you who want to follow up, there's an overview, and also the whole report can be africantransformation, one word.org. We use that indicators to form an index to show how African countries rank in terms of these 5 elements of debt and the other sub-indicators that go into it. What we are showing here is the ranking of African countries in 2010, which is basically the average of 2009, 2010, and 2011. And the numbers in next to each countries, how they've changed from 2000, which is also an average of 1999, 2000, 2001, over the 10-year period. So, for instance, Mauritius was number 1 in 2010, and also was number 1 in 2000 because the change. I mean, its rank hasn't changed. Whereas Senegal is number 4 in 2010, but it used to be number 3 in 2000. Note that my own country, Ghana, which is celebrated, hasn't done very well. It's rather very low down the line, and in fact has even fallen over the 10-year period. Another country that's usually ranks very high when only you're considering only GDP per capita, Botswana, is number 10 here, I think. And over the 10-year period, it also has fallen. So that what this measure, African Transformation Index, is measuring is really a lot more comprehensive than just GDP per capita or how much. And we want to use this as a way of comparing African countries. We pick a period, as we've done, say 2010, we can rank African countries, and hopefully if you're an African leader and you don't like where your country is, you call us all kinds of names, but at least at the end of the day, it motivates you to do something different so that you can change your scores. And I say, of course, in the same country too, you can see how you've been over a 10-year period or a 3-year period. We can do this for different time periods. Okay. So I guess, the review of all this shows that if we compare African countries, as a group, to the comparator countries over a 40-year period, in terms of structure, the diversification, technology, productivity, and all the rest, nothing much has changed, right? And therefore, we need to really begin to focus on this and trying to how we change direction. And this is irrespective of whether you look at the period from, say, 1970s up to early 80s, where governments were running, very import substitution, government-led, and all this thing, or whether you look at post the mid-1980s, when they had a structural adjustment, get the government out of the business and roll back and let the private sector take over. Basically, the structure hasn't changed. So what we are saying is that we need to learn from this experience, learn from what was good in those two periods, and jettison the bad and try to fashion something that's very appropriate to Africa and to let us move faster in this transformation front. And what we are saying is that, there's been a lot of ideological debate. The part, governments were taking the commanding highs and, they were going to develop economy. That didn't amount to much. And in the structural adjustment, governments were about get them out, and the private sector, that didn't go on. So we're saying that there's a middle ground where the government and the private sector can form a productive partnership. And in fact, that's what they did in most countries in East Asia. So let's get rid of this sort of ideological blinkers and be very pragmatic and look at what are the areas where governments and the private sector can form a productive partnership to try to drive this agenda forward. And then, in fact, if you don't have time to read any other report and you have to read only one chapter, I recommend this chapter 2. The first chapter is about the technical issues of the index and all this, and then data analysis. But this is basically set the framework of basically how the private sector and the government need to collaborate. And we make a number of important things. The private sector is going to lead in the production, distribution, marketing of goods. But the government has a big role in setting a clear vision and a strategy. Government, of course, also have to have traditional economic management, the exchange rate, a good environment for the private sector. But our reading of history, going back to, 13th century Europe, the US, East Asia, and everywhere, is that at the beginning of transformation, late development, government have an active role to play in helping countries assess new technology, assess new markets, and helping the private sector to venture into new activities and all of that. And so there's a positive role for government. But having said that, we also recognize that just because there's a role doesn't mean that government will play it well. There are many cases where governments have gone in there and make things much, much worse, right? But we also say that just because there's that risk doesn't mean that you give up on development and don't take any risk. So the issue is that how do you do it in a much more balanced way? And we suggest it's not rocket science. First, there needs to be effective coordination within government. Most governments have a very difficulty. One hand doesn't know what the others do. With the report talks a bit about that. We also talk about important mechanism for the government and the private sector and other stakeholders in the economy to constantly talk in a much more substantive way, so that informing the strategy, agreeing on specific transformational projects, there's a lot more input, because you need a private sector and a market sense. I mean, bureaucrats don't run markets. They may, by talking to the private sector, they can get ideas and then they can provide the type of policies that can help them go on. So we go into that. We also, before I go in there, we recognize in many African countries now you're beginning to have competitive politics. And the type of horizon that a 4-year electoral cycle demands, and the horizon that a transformation, I mean, national transformation requires 20, 30 years of consistent direction and effort. You may change tactics, but the main direction needs to be consistent. And when you have countries changing in elections and governments changing, it becomes a problem. And in many countries, this in some become a problem. How you deal with it, we don't have answers. We provide some suggestions, but I think this is something that increasingly many African countries have to grapple with. How do you pursue a long-term transformation agenda within a competitive, pluralistic, democratic environment? I think it's core. Then the next chapter, takes the issues discussed in this institutional framework to apply it to export. And then basically we're just saying that in many African countries, if you're a small, medium-sized economy, you have to export. The types of proactive export promotion instruments, say, that the East Asian countries used are now no longer available because of the WTO. So the question that we asked in our report, how do you then proactively promote exports within this restricted policy space, and how do you do it? And we provide some suggestions. First, coming from the fact, you have to have a clear export strategy that you promote. You have to identify your low-hanging fruit, and you have to, talking to the private sector, find out what is required in order to push it to the next level. And then the next set of chapters basically goes into how you some of the themes that can be used to promote this. It's not exhaustive. The reports give out a number of menus, but this chapter 6, about 3 or 4 of them, and then hopefully we'll take others in the other report. So we talk about, by the way, before I go, in exports, another part that we have is that the rise of China is really it's a really game changer, both for the positive and also a challenge. The top graph shows where the markets are expanding. So we are saying that in promoting exports, we need to not only look at the traditional OECD market. Please just let me know how much time I have so that I can rush and finish. Not only the traditional OECD markets, which still remain the biggest, but if you look at the graphs, they're really growing very slowly, and China, Brazil, and India are really rising fast. So we made recommendations how we tap these markets while at the same time making more effective use of still the largest OECD market. The lower graph shows China, as it's a challenge that China poses. Because of the high demand for raw materials and everything, prices have gone up. It allows many African countries to go faster and become richer. But it poses a challenge. The slide, most of our exports there are agricultural fuels and commodities. The last sliver in the middle is manufacturing goods. So the question is that in our engagement with China, how do we expand that little blue thing there so that we can actually over time increase our manufactures? That will require conscious export strategy, how we develop that. Some of those elements in overall transformation and exports will depend on building our skills. In 2050, Africa will have the largest youth population, bigger than China or India. We've done a lot, and we've done pretty well in primary school enrollment, even though quality is still a problem. But we don't do so well when you get to secondary, tertiary levels, and even within tertiary levels at the STEM disciplines, where it was basically science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And the report said that there's a long-term agenda where you reform the system, but there's also a short-term agenda where you, using your export development strategy and FDR strategy, attract people, and then also building a short-term training system that's very much aligned with what the private sector demands, so that you get some of your educated unemployed off the streets and into powering your short-term transformation strategy. Because increasingly, as weird as it sounds, although we are training less than 12% of our people in tertiary education, about close to half of them come out and they are unemployed. And in Ghana, we have an unemployed graduates association, and that is something that's going on in the African countries. And we need to have focused short-term strategies to do that. And the report discusses some of how we might approach that. In terms of what we bring to the table in transformation and export, very quickly, our biggest comparative advantage is labor, a lot of it, and also natural resources. We have a lot of labor, but it's not necessarily cheap if you factor in productivity. That's why skills come in, and the skills development comes in as a very important thing. We looked at garments, which traditionally has been how countries have started on the industrialization ladder. We looked at components assembly, TV, computers. That's why East Asia managed to rise up. It hasn't happened in Africa. Why not? We talk to private sector people, and the report provides a number of what they say in order to allow them, to encourage them to come to Africa. We also, and then one interesting thing that we do in the report is what we call stars of FDI manufacturing. For instance, in the components assembly, the global value chain is that these are basically controlled by global multinationals. In order to do it, you need to attract FDI. And so we looked at, and there's a lot of data in the world that about dollar volumes of FDI flows, but we haven't seen any analysis that shows where FDIs are actually putting manufacturing factories. And this is a first attempt to try to document that and to compare African countries. Not to say that every country should have the same number of factories, but if you are Kenya and Ghana, roughly similar size economies, and Kenya has about 20 and Ghana has about 5, if I were a Ghanaian policymaker, I would ask questions. Why? What am I doing wrong? Very quickly, then we also look at agriculture, where we segmented it into 3: the traditional, the non-traditional, and then the urban, the food stuff. And we provide ways on how Africa can really add value. We didn't go into actually transforming agriculture, but basically giving what we produce now, how can we add value? And then we also look at mineral and oil and gas resources, and we're saying that you should have the capacity to know what you have, negotiate well for what you need to, you're getting. You should be able to link it, since it's exhaustible, to other sectors of the economy, and above all, the capacity of government to choose and manage expenditures is critical. Otherwise, it becomes a curse. And also look at tourism as a way of providing employment and financing transformation.
Yaw, thank you so much. That was a really fantastic overview there. I think a lot of these themes we'll take up in the discussion as well, but I was very struck actually by the way you framed skills agenda. Mm-hmm. Because one model that really stands out for me is Brazil, where over across electoral cycles you have this system of the private sector working with government and unions. It's actually based on the German model, more or less. And actually, President Lula was a graduate of that system. But the interesting thing about it is that it survived, across those electoral cycles that you mentioned. Tony, over to you to comment.